Hello, this is Jose Giovanni Lopez, and I will be virtually presenting on my poster today as part of the Berkeley Engineering Research Experience for Teachers, Artificial Intelligence Resources for Clean Environment, of my work with Anne Berenger's lab under the mentorship of Alexandra Collard on the topic of from research mentorship to student ownership, a case of study of influence of scientific inquiry in K-12 teachers' practices from research experiences. So to go over a little bit of background, undergraduate research experiences, which I will review to UREs, are pretty well known in the scientist's journey in undergraduate studies and have benefits such as increasing self-efficacy in science identity and understanding of design-based learning and engineering processes. For teachers who participate in these processes in undergraduate study, there's also some promises in its translation into education, such as developing a scientist identity amongst teachers and their students in the academic achievement. However, there is a need to really assess this direct translation. We assume teacher experiences something directly and students experience it as well, but there are things such as the theoretical frameworks of UREs, the measurement of the actual translation, participant takeaways of science identity, the nature of science, how one learns science concepts, and epistemic development are just amongst a variety of factors of things that still need a little bit of assessment to really see how the translation happens. So in this 6-week program, I sought to answer the questions: how are teachers working with students' ideas during teaching to support inquiry skills, and how do teachers' own experiences and perspectives of inquiry and research influence these actions? So we studied 2 different third-year science teachers in different Bay Area high schools, both identifying as female and Asian. We'll call them Miss Albert and Miss Longs. Teaching 9th grade biology and 10th grade physics respectively. They have a variety of different research experiences, with Ms. Albert primarily focusing on psychology research and Ms. Long's focusing on more science education. Their terms are relatively similar, and we basically collected 3 different data text sets for each teacher. It included a pre-interview for a lesson, the observation of the actual lesson, which there's information on the content there, and a post-interview for a total of 6 different data texts. Upon review of this data, we use the theoretical frameworks of case studies and thematic analysis to really guide us through different stages of this analysis process. First, really initial reads for general impressions and themes on individual notes. A get together with our 3 members, which included Alexandra, Jessica, Juan, and myself, to develop a draft codebook with a combination of deductive frameworks, which are listed here, such as knowledge integration, domains of inquiry, the tripartite integration model of social influence and culture responsive teaching, as well as our own kind of like ways of seeing different themes in different categories, which we'll call inductive. Together, we started different multiple rounds of coding on MaxQDA and Google Docs and got together to basically discuss if we were coding similar things, like if we thought there was a domain of inquiry of like social domain or something that was more teacher versus student-centered pedagogy, we would meet to kind of get this agreement. Eventually, we arrived at consensus for 3 of these texts: the Longs pre-interview, the Albert pre-interview, and the Albert post-interview. And reported here are the intercoder agreements holistically, as we kind of got to a place where we were basically coding similarly. And amongst the most prominent results that we found were that amongst both teachers, research influences teachers to plan for and focus on students doing the science. By virtue of them participating in actual research, they are very much focused on what are the students doing in their class, giving them that sense of autonomy and really driving a lot of student-centered pedagogy in all aspects of their planning, before, during, and after the lessons. Particular codes of interest are student-centered pedagogy during teaching, social domain, and we saw rich engagement practices for this as well. So really tapping into their pedagogical knowledge, such as connections to prior knowledge and relevance to students, to really make sure that students were tapping into their own rich banks of knowledge. We also saw an interesting theme of describing science as socially constructed. And this is kind of prominent in some of these quotes that we have here, that describe as research as kind of a lie. These questions about what even is science, and really having themselves reflect and teach students that there's a real value in kind of breaking down things that we think of as really objective. Um, by virtue of us really thinking about this through a constructive lens, these teachers are already starting to really put students in the driver's seat of thinking about how does one formulate knowledge, which relates to the epistemic domain teaching codes, and this idea of confidence and uncertainty in data, that data doesn't just prove something is right or wrong. There's always going to be a level of like bias into it. In terms of the differences amongst these teachers, we found the culturally responsive teaching framework to really inform something that Ms. Longs was doing both during as a researcher and as a teacher in developing learning partnerships with their mentor, that we believe really translated into a lot of not just student-centered pedagogy, but a deeper level of that in the form of student ownership in studies. Here are a couple of quotes that really describe how there was this level of seeing their teacher as, sorry, the teacher seeing their professor as a human that we believe really allowed not just for a lot of the social domain of inquiry that helps these bonds strengthen in the research experiences and in the classroom, but that really allowed the teacher to interrogate the differences between making a task not just something that students were doing, but that they were actually taking academic risks. And this was in a classroom that they described having a variety of different cultural factors that made that difficult. And yet we saw both in observations and in reflection that a sense of belonging was really linked to this noticeable action of students being able to volunteer their own authentic ideas beyond what was planned from the teacher. We are able to support these differences in these most common code concurrences tables that describe basically when one code was coded at the same spot as another one. And we can see here that the student-centered pedagogy and the ownership and agency, as well as again, the culturally responsive teaching frameworks of learning partnerships and awareness really coexisted in the Longs teacher, whereas for the Albert teacher, the teacher-centered pedagogy and the conceptual domains coexisted the most, meaning that while there was still student-centered pedagogy, really focusing on the conceptual way of thinking of science inquiry led to more teacher-centered actions and takeaways and reflections. So a couple of limitations. This is a single instance for both of these teachers, meaning it's really difficult to describe themes or changes in particular. And there's also a difficulty to capture students' internal processes and picks, as we were only able to focus on what teachers were doing in both of these cases. And I think we still need a little bit more time to get to a common page of agreement amongst all of our researchers for full confidence in terms of consensus. In terms of next steps, I believe that we have a strong case for the culture responsive teaching framework to really not just surface what's happening in the classrooms socially, but also what's happening in the research experiences, given that mentorship was a prominent theme amongst the teacher who was able to really elicit a lot of student ownership and agency in their classroom. And I believe we can also ask more explicit questions about specific identities such as race and gender to really elicit how those are developing in concurrence with science identity. AI was particularly useful in providing feedback on codebook for gaps in codes within categories if they found that certain things were happening in some of the interviews that were not necessarily being captured in the codebook. They suggested a couple of these nuances or based on our definitions. We coded in a private UC Berkeley server to protect this data for it also coding with our own codebook. And while the generated intercoder reliability shows that we need to spend a little bit more time to really keep prompting it specifically, we believe with specific and detailed prompting, such as using the phrase "you are a qualitative science education researcher," using the process systematic analysis by Bunn and Clark, really domain-specific prompts, it could generate a little bit more of a reliable takeaway from what we see in the data as well. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I want to shout out my mentor, whose daily mentorship through the 6-week program was invaluable. Our other colleague, Jess, and other folks of the Behringer ChemMed Lab, as well as the BERET Air cohort of 2026, and particularly Ari for leading that experience. This definitely left a very promising, I think, for me, take on my own capabilities as a science education researcher. So thank you for listening.